We are now.
Great, awesome. And we are going to ask participants to have their cameras and microphones off to preserve my bandwidth. Is that Kalia? Thanks, Kalia. So, great. Participants, we're going to remind you, could you have your cameras and microphones off during the presentation to help preserve the bandwidth? Even if you are my boyfriend, Hardy. Right, okay. So Claire, I think we're ready to start.
Okay, thanks everyone for joining us today. We are absolutely delighted to welcome our very own Shireen John to close out LIDC's Black History Month activities with their seminar on the Krios. And Shireen is LIDC's communication coordinator and a very critical part of our events team. She's joined LIDC, just a little bit of background, in 2015 from the University of Syracuse. She has a BA from London Met University and an MA from Birkbeck. So Shireen grew up in Sierra Leone in the very halcyon days, post-colonial days of the 1970s. And in the 1990s, Shireen returned back to Sierra Leone from the UK, where she was very involved in the retelling of the history of the transatlantic slave trade. When Sierra Leone unfortunately descended into civil conflict during the 1990s, she joined the International Rescue Committee until the situation unfortunately compelled her to leave. Shireen is a lifelong anti-racism activist. She's led campaigns against racism and apartheid since the 1980s. In her work with LIDC, she convenes the decolonization working group across our 7-member colleges. This is a really important piece of work, and we're very grateful to Shireen for undertaking it. Following the murder of George Floyd, she organized probably one of our biggest and most successful seminars of all time on racism and global development. And that story continues, and Shireen's been working very hard on that. I think we had maybe over 450 signups. We're very grateful to Shireen for giving us her time today and reminding us that, you know, history is not owned and controlled by the few. She's retelling us the story of her Creo ancestors as survivors born of a freedom of desire for freedom rather than passive victims, which is often the kind of way this story is told. So Shireen, a very big welcome and thank you.
Thank you, Claire. I think I'm now going to struggle to live up to my own publicity. But I will start by saying thank you so much, everyone who's signed up for this event, and indeed for any of LIDC's events. While you're here and before I start, I'm going to remind you that we are an active organisation of development professionals. So after the seminar, do please check out our website and refer back to the email that I sent you yesterday. So that said, I'm very honoured to be here. As Claire said, I am a very proud Creo from Sierra Leone. I grew up being taught a history of how the British saved us from freedom. And over the course of my life, I've been fortunate enough to meet people who've introduced me to a rather different perspective. So before we start the presentation proper, I'm going to do something that's quite unusual, which is ask everyone if they would honor me by joining in a few moments silence. And the reason I want to do this is so that we focus ourselves and honor the memory of my ancestors and the ancestors of a lot of you who lost their lives and liberty because of this barbaric trade in Black bodies, and to honour those who have lost their lives as a direct result of the racial discrimination that persists to this day. So with your permission, I'd like to start with just a brief silence while we honour their memories and centre ourselves. Thank you. Thank you. So I'm going to start. I hope you can all see my screen. I know that my view blocks some of it from me, but I wanted to start by saying a little bit about the tiny country of Sierra Leone. I actually only discovered recently that Sierra Leone had been inhabited for over 2,500 years. And as anyone who's been to Sierra Leone, even just the capital city, will know that we have a lot of lush rainforest. And this, back in the day, provided cover for people who were escaping violence. The name Sierra Leone stems from the Portuguese guy, Pedro de Sintra, who sailed there in Sierra Leone. I know you'll understand the fact that I will not describe him as having discovered our country, but he sailed there in 1462 and he noticed the range of hills that grew up close to the shoreline, very close to one of the deepest and most magnificent natural harbours. And that harbour on the west coast of Sierra Leone made it an ideal trading port. So the map on the right of your screen will show a lot of the areas of current day Sierra Leone. You'll see it's bordered by Guinea to the north and Liberia to the south. And then the map to the right actually shows the nations of people who mainly inhabit Sierra Leone. And I would prefer to use the word nations because that's how we describe different ethnicities in Sierra Leone. I know in England people would tend to describe them as tribes, but I'd like to stick to the word nation. Those of you who talk Creo will know that if we ask people where they're from, we'll say Yunaus Nation, and they'll say Mina Timni, Mina Mende, Mina Yalanka, and so on. So I'm going to stick to that. Right, again, another thing that I didn't learn in school, maybe I was taught and forgot, but I didn't know very much about this. I will say, though, that there is a Sierra Leonean historian called Joe Ali, and my friend Abdul sent me his book, which I have found invaluable. It's a new history of Sierra Leone, and he does talk about the Mane invasion from the 16th century. And the Mane were people who invaded Sierra Leone after their chief, who was a woman called Macario, was expelled. And the reason I'm talking about the Mane is because two of the nations in Sierra Leone, the most well-known, the Loko and the Mende people, their cultures are both still heavily influenced by Mane culture and language. Interestingly enough, not the Temni, who were the people who withstood the Mane invasions. And I think this is probably significant because, as we'll get to hear, the Temne people are the people who ruled the area where Bunce Island, which was a massive in terms of the traffic that went through it, but not massive because of its size, because as you'll see shortly, it's incredibly small. And that's one of the contradictions of this story, that this small, beautiful island could have been the locus for such violent and devastating acts. But the Temne ruled the area where Bunce Island is situated in the river Sierra Leone. And their kings were also the ones who leased land, both to the philanthropists who set up the first province of freedom of people who had escaped slavery. And I'll be talking later about one of the most famous kings named Bana, who ruled that area. So one of the questions that often comes up when talking to people about the legacy of the slave trade is, I often hear people say, but slavery's always existed. It wasn't just, the Americans and the British, there's always been slavery, like that's a good thing. So I think I want to step back for a second and acknowledge that yes, coerced labor, slavery has existed in nearly all societies, from the Roman Empire to the Ottoman Empire. I remember when I was working at Syracuse University and I first became acquainted with the history of the Ottoman Empire, it was really astounding to me that Ottoman warriors could seize African boys, and these African boys could then be converted into Islam, because of course Muslims don't enslave other Muslims. So they would capture people who weren't Muslims, convert them to Islam, bring them to the Ottoman court. And there were corps of black janissaries, black soldiers fighting in the Ottoman Empire. There were black viziers. Black people could rise up through the Ottoman Empire to become grand viziers. So yes, there was slavery in the sense that people were captured in war and weren't able to return to their home. However, those forms of slavery were not on the industrialized scale that the transatlantic slave trade followed. Walter Rodney, who I imagine a lot of you know about, he's the famous historian who was killed tragically young in 1980. He wrote the book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, which I urge you all to read. He noted that even the Portuguese, who were in Sierra Leone from the 15th century, were meticulous record keepers, yet they never mentioned any form of chattel slavery at all, even though around this time Arabs were enslaving Africans and exporting them, it sounds horrible, but yeah, when you commodify people, those are the terms that come into play, to the Middle East and Europe around there. And I've got a picture here of the famous emperor, Mansa Musa, who ruled the kingdom of Mali, who had 12,000 enslaved people accompany him on his 1324 pilgrimage to Mecca. Right, so again, those of you who are Creo or who are acquainted with the Creo language will know that people who, like me, are lighter skinned and white people are often called opotu in the streets. You would hear it quite a lot. And I always wondered where that phrase, opotu, opotu, where did it come from? And I suspected that it might be something to do with the Portuguese, who we know were very early arrivals to our coast. And yes, it did. It was a corruption of the word Portuguese. The Portuguese, a lot of them intermarried. They also built forts along the coastline of Sierra Leone because, of course, they weren't there for the good of their health. They were there to make money. And they refer in their records to some foreigners who would voluntarily place themselves under the records of kings, so effectively volunteering to go into slavery. They would retain some rights, but they did lose the most essential of all rights, which is the right to resist being bought and sold. Another interesting book that I've come across recently that discusses Africans capturing other Africans is this incredible book about the warrior women of Dahomey. And again, it describes people being captive and moving in with having to leave their family and move in with their captors. And again, the way in which quote unquote slaves were treated was completely different from what has now become a common part of the story of the transatlantic slave. So a little bit of history. A lot of you will know about Jack Hawkins, who was kind of the father of transatlantic slavery on England's behalf. And also another famous slaver was that favorite of Elizabeth I of England, you know, the wonderful gentleman who lay down his cape so she could walk on it. Yes, no less than Francis Drake. He was one of the most famous slavers. In the mid-1600s, the British Royal Africa Company set up forts along the coast of Sierra Leone, and these were subsequently attacked by Dutch. The British withdrew and they left behind their mixed race offspring. And the Creos who are here today, you'll be very familiar with the names Corkers, the Tuckers, the Clevelands, the Rogers. So a lot of them were descended from English people who had sprung from the British Royal Africa Company. And another name worth mentioning is the author of the hymn Amazing Grace. A lot of you will know him as being the slaver who was in a storm and was saved. And when his life was saved, he suddenly realized what a terrible life he was living as a slaver. I mean, go figure what it takes to wake some people up. And he went on to describe the wretched conditions that captured Africans were kept in. Now, I doubt that there is anyone at this webinar today who isn't familiar with this awful diagram of how captured Africans were packed into ships to sail across the ocean. I'm not going to go verse and chapter through the mechanics of how the slave trade worked. I think we all know about it, but I do think it's worth reiterating some of the figures, one of which is, remember, we are talking about from the early 16th century to the 19th century, when populations everywhere were much lower. And bearing that in mind, just the figure of 12.5 million that we know about, Africans being captured, chained, marched through the bush, and sold to British people, put in canoes. Many of them had never seen the sea or rivers before, to be sold to another country that they had no conception of. I think it's worth reiterating that 3 million of these at least were sold by British people. And of course, as we know, death was factored in to the figures of the economics of the trade. So 10.5 million survived the Middle Passage, which of course means, you do the maths, how many million people left to perish on the journey and on the bottom of the seas. So most of the captured Africans were sent to South America, particularly Brazil, and what came to be known as the West Indies, the Caribbean. And what's surprising, I think, for a lot of those of us that are interested in transatlantic slavery, is that it was really only a very tiny percentage, about 388,000 of over 10.5 million people who went to the plantations of North America. And you will know, if you've know anything about the transatlantic slave trade, that people from West Africa were particularly sent to the coastal regions, Florida, Carolina, Louisiana, Georgia, because of their skills in rice cultivation. And these were areas of North America where crops like rice and of course sugar and cotton were grown. I put here a picture, a painting of Bunce Island as it was at the height of its prowess as a slave trading fort. This place, many of us have been to, is of crucial importance in the history of the slave trade. It's not been maintained very well, and I hope that everyone who watches this will take a moment to find out more about the role that Bunce Island played in the history of Sierra Leone and in therefore the history of African Americans. As you can see in the photograph on the right, Bunce Island is tiny. You really can't, I mean, if you think about it, 105 meters, we've all seen Usain Bolt do a 10-second dash in 100 meters. That's how big this island is. I'm going to talk here a bit about what actually happened on this island. And I'm going to refer again to a book by, if you get a chance to read this book, read it. It's absolutely fascinating. It's a story by a woman called Anna Maria Falkenbridge. It's called The Narrative of Two Voyages to the River Sierra Leone. Sorry, I haven't done a biography, but this is being recorded, so you can go back later and find out about these sources. And Anna Maria Falkenbridge was a very young woman. She's about 22 years old the first time she went to Sierra Leone in 1791. And she went with her husband, who was actually part of the movement to abolish slavery in Britain. So they were a British couple. Now they became acquainted with the slave traders who were based at Bunce Island. And in her book, Anna Maria Falkenbridge describes the juxtaposition of being in the residential quarters of the slave trading fort, and she's upstairs. And if you go to Bunce Island now, because it's almost like open access, you will still see remnants of bottles and crockeries and so on that the slave traders used to host dinner parties with. So she was invited effectively to a dinner party and served very nice wine, and it was all very civilized, music playing, and she happened to wander over to one of the windows and look down and saw the most horrific sight of naked hundreds of people jammed into the area that you can see at the back of the house in the description, in the picture there, all together eating mushy rice from a trough like animals. And it was so shocking to her because of course she knew that the slave trade existed. That's why she and her husband had traveled to Sierra Leone, was to find out more about it, and so that they could help the campaign against it. But she had no idea of the brutal conditions that these human beings were being kept with. One of the things that you will have seen if you've watched any documentaries about the transatlantic slave trade is the sections where they drag Africans up from the quarters of the ship onto the decks of the ship and force them to well, they try and get them to dance to the beat of their drum. They try and force alcohol into them. And these same procedures happened on Bunce Island. As you can imagine, people being captured by other Africans and then brought by them and their white supervisors on forced marches across hundreds of miles through rainforest, chained by the neck and the legs to one another, not knowing where they were going, because this wasn't like a regular war thing. This was like really new and strange. And then being shoved in the bottom of canoes. Again, Anna Maria Falkenbridge describes the wretchedness of these people as they were being dragged out of canoes. They'd never seen a canoe or the sea before. You're not going to be very sociable, let's face it. And they were cargo for these slave traders. So what would happen is every now and then the slave traders would organize drumming and try and force the Africans to dance. But many of them in that condition were so depressed and so frightened. And what the slave traders did was term this as the lethargy. So they wanted to wake up these people from the lethargy because of course they needed them in good health so that they could be sold for money and profit. It's very hard for me not to get a bit emotional, thinking about what people actually went through. I've got here, if you will indulge me, a short video of Bunce Island that's presented by an African Sierra Leone woman historian, and I hope the link works so you can see it. Sorry about that.
Today's is your day. There's a fitter.
As you approach Bunce Island, it's quiet and calm. But little more than 200 years ago, this shoreline was the departure point for thousands of Sierra Leoneans who were forced onto ships and transported to the Americas as slaves.
This is the jetty down which African captives were marched.
Isatu Smith is with the National Commission working to preserve the history of the island. She's looking for funds and to raise awareness among Sierra Leoneans about their heritage.
Because I see the need to preserve these things, and I see the scarcity, the lack of.
Sorry, I'm going to try and reshare that screen again. Sorry, apologies for that.
As you approach Bunce Island, it's quiet.
So bear with me. Hopefully I'll get this to work now. There we go.
and calm. But little more than 200 years ago, this shoreline was the departure point for thousands of Sierra Leoneans who were forced onto ships and turned as slaves.
Which African captives were mashed.
Isatu Smith is with the National Commission working to preserve the history of the island. She's looking for funds and to raise awareness among Sierra Leoneans about their heritage.
Because I see the need to preserve these things, and I see the scarcity, the lack of interest and expertise in this field. And I feel like if some of us don't step up, this is all gonna go to waste.
It's difficult to see now, but Bunce Island was once the biggest slave port in Sierra Leone. A watchtower still stands, as well as a slave trader's residence. And through this doorway is where men, women, and children were held separately. A chief in a nearby community says he is one of the direct descendants of a foreman who worked on the island.
When the place is developed, the descendants will come and see the origin of their ancestors. So I'm happy for this development.
There's no official numbers, but it's estimated 20,000 to 50,000 Sierra Leoneans were brought here as slaves between 1670 and 1808. Great Britain abolished the slave trade in 1807, but it took another year before it ended here. Bunce Island's link to North America remains strong. This historian says a community of African Americans in South Carolina and Georgia are known as the Gullah people. They were direct descendants of Sierra Leonean slaves. Many of them have visited the slave fort.
And they have maintained in very many ways the culture and certain aspects of Sierra Leonean culture and tradition. And that's a very thriving community in the US, which again is one of the legacies, perhaps, of Bunce Island.
The fort has been declared a national monument. It could become a World Heritage Site.
This was a double door entrance.
Isatu Smith hopes people in her homeland, as well as abroad, will have been learning more about this deep part of history. Nina DeVries, Al Jazeera, Bunce Island, Sierra Leone.
If you work in a team, you've got to try Monday.com.
Okay, thank you very much for bearing with me while I put that on. I'm going to go back to my presentation. Great, that seems to be working. So let's continue. So I think when we're talking about the effect on African countries of the slave trade, we also ought to think about the people who were not enslaved and why they weren't enslaved, what happened to them. And one of the people I'm going to refer to is a king, a Temni king called King Nembana. And I've since found out that even though all the history books describe him as Nembana, it's very likely that his name wasn't Nembana. The story goes, if you read African histories, that he was asked his name by the British and he replied, me, Nembana, Nembana, and they called him Nembana, like you do. Anyway, so he was regent of the Koya chiefdom from 1775 to 93, and he, obviously everyone in that area could see what was happening with white people coming up and setting up slave trading forts and Africans being dragged there in chains, and he was opposed to the slave trade, but not powerful enough to stop it happening. In fact, he made certain allegiances with the slave traders. He was very progressive. He believed in the power of education, and he even sent his 2 sons to be educated in Britain, which you can imagine was quite a risky prospect. You're putting your African sons on these ships at the height of the slave trade, where at any point they could be, captured and sold into slavery. And in fact, he was, some historians say that the land that the British used for a colony in Sierra Leone was actually tricked by another king called King Tom. So I've used the words treaties and trickery because I think there was quite a lot of that duplicity going on up and down the coast of West Africa throughout the course of the slave trade. with slavers having, of course, to negotiate the right to settle there and carry on their trade. And of course, the inherent bribery of, you know, what slaves were traded for. But again, I won't go into detail about that. I'm going to fast forward now. So I think I'm going to assume on the part of people here that we're all aware of how Africans were treated during plantation slavery. One of the things that isn't very well acknowledged is how powerful word of mouth was as a means of communications between Africans of different countries. They did make very close links with one another. They did share information with one another. And it wasn't too long before Africans in the colonies got to hear about a case, a famous case in London, the Somerset Case, which was where a captured African who had arrived in London with his quote unquote owner escaped because he had been led to believe that, as had been publicly decreed in another court case, that the air in Britain was too pure for slaves to breathe. And this translated as, if you got to Britain, you could be free. So I'm going to ask you for a second here to put yourselves in the position disenfranchised, dispossessed, African person who can be hunted down as property manages to escape and sail from the Caribbean, from North America to Britain in search of freedom. I just cannot imagine the amount of determination and resourcefulness that it would take to do that. And then they would arrive here. One of the other ways that they ended up in England was that throughout the British colony of what we now know as the United States, both the British and the southern slave owning states, both of them throughout the entirety of the slave trade had a mechanism for getting slaves to side with them as they fought one another. And this is often referred to as the slaves' gamble. Both sides would offer slaves that if you fight for me against either the British or the southern slaveholding states, that we will give you your freedom. Some of those promises were kept, and often what would happen with Africans if they deserted their southern masters and went to fight on the British side, called the loyalist side, is they would then be moved north of America to Canada, to Nova Scotia and Halifax, which is where they would be resettled. The conditions in Canada were terrible. A lot of the freed Africans who got to Nova Scotia, Halifax, found that the way that they were living, they may have been free in name, but it didn't feel much like freedom. The land that they were given to work was basically impossible to farm on. They suffered a lot from vicious cold. They had no resources, and it was more of an existence than a life. So a lot of people found their way from Canada. You know how far away Canada is if you've ever been to North America or Canada by plane. Imagine making your way on a sailboat as an escaped African to England to try to get real freedom. And as you can see, when they from this etching here, when they arrived in England, they weren't exactly brought into a land of milk and honey. A lot of them lived in the area where I am now, near Warren Street, where they would get a weekly sixpence to live on, but they were very destitute, and their numbers continued to grow as word continued to spread that if you made it to England, you could be free. And I'm not going to go into the Mansa case and the Somerset case, but I would advise you to read up the sort of nuances of that and how it worked. Now, eventually, I guess a lot of you won't be surprised to find that the sight of poor Black people in areas around Warren Street, St. Giles, very central London, sort of the West End of London now, decided to destitute Black people wasn't the sight that the ruling classes wanted to see. So a committee of philanthropists called the Committee for the Relief of the Black Poor was set up. And many of you again will know of Olaudah Equiano. He was actually on that first committee. And he resigned because he really wasn't happy with the decisions that were being taken about how to provide relief for the Black poor. Eventually, the plan was, we're going to help these people by getting them out of here. We're going to send them back to Africa. They decided that the place they would send them to would be the west coast of Sierra Leone. And the central figure behind this plan was the philanthropist Granville Sharp. So in 1787, 280 Black men, 70 white women, and sorry, I'm just going to move, and 40 Black women sailed from Plymouth to Sierra Leone. Now, the plan started to fall apart before it even got off the ground. And it started to fall apart because it had just been very poorly thought through. They arrived in Sierra Leone, in their province, which was then called Granville Town, the Province of Freedom. The seeds that they were given to farm with didn't even last the journey. If you know Sierra Leone, you will know that up till now, it's riven with vicious mosquitoes. Malaria is a massive killer in Sierra Leone still to this day. These people were not prepared. There was no preparation done. They hadn't negotiated with the local Timni people. They suddenly just turned up with these ships of bedraggled, poor Black people and some white women who some historians allege were prostitutes that were basically being deported from their own country. And they didn't get on with the local Timni people. They didn't speak their language. They didn't understand customs. And certain disagreements happened, which led to them actually being burnt out. So that colony basically just failed. Right, so the survivors of that, of course, remained. Where were they going to go? But by 1792, there were yet more freed Africans who'd originally fought for the British in the American wars, who'd made their way from Nova Scotia. And as I said, the lives that they were living there were absolutely rotten. So step forward the brave and wonderful Thomas Peters. I would love one day for there to be a movie made dedicated to the heroism of Thomas Peters. Every time I talk about him, I want to cry. But he went from door to door in Canada. And I want you also to be conscious of the fact that poor, impoverished Africans in Nova Scotia, a lot of them had gone into domestic servitude. And so they were, you know, almost like bonded labor still. He was literally going to church services, talking to people in the street, calling people to one side away from their master's house, and convinced people to back his plan to revive the colony of freedom in Sierra Leone. And again, this meant sailing across the high seas, going all the way to Britain, petitioning the Houses of Parliament, convincing them to agree, because they owned the place, why wouldn't they, but to let them use the colony, going back to Canada, getting everyone together, 1,200 people together who sailed in what subsequently became known as a Black Exodus from Nova Scotia to Sierra Leone. Now, they had learned some lessons from what had happened in 1787, and they certainly were better prepared. And they also had the backing of philanthropists like Governor Clarkson, and so on. I think there are Creos here who could probably tell you a little bit more about them in the discussion if we have time for that. So they arrived in Sierra Leone, and it was better than 1787, but it still wasn't good. And one of the things that wasn't good was the conditions that the Africans were living in, and they tried to petition to the philanthropists for better conditions. Thomas Perkins and his ally, Cato Perkins were actually seen as being troublemakers. So here is a photograph of my partner and a statue to Thomas Peters, which is in the center of Freetown. So it's really important that he be recognized for what he went through. He tried to fight for better conditions for the settlers, for the Nova Scotian settlers, and it didn't go very well for him. He ended up being broken, basically. He wasn't able to negotiate for the conditions that he wanted. He became labeled as a troublemaker, and towards the end of his life, he was framed, if you like. He was accused of stealing clothes, and this just broke him. He just died. He basically died of depression. He died a broken man. So, you know, while the philanthropists like Granville Sharp and Governor Clarkson, they were good people and they opposed slavery and they did what they did to help, but they were still from the ruling elite. And I think they still had a certain view of Africans that you shouldn't go above your station. And I think this very much affected the psychosocial, if not the material well-being of the freed Africans then. So fast forwarding now, basically, to 200 years after 1792, we know that although that there was a rebellion of the 1792 settlers, which I will come back to later, and that 1792 rebellion was put down, but people remained. People who arrived from Nova Scotia did remain in Freetown. Granville Town, the province of freedom, then became Freetown. And I was lucky enough in 1992 to be in Sierra Leone to host a delegation of those who didn't make it, the descendants of African escapees who stayed in Nova Scotia, and their memory is now being honoured by various museums and what have you. But a delegation of them travelled to Sierra Leone in 1992 to see where their aunties and uncles were. And here's some photographs of Bunce Island as it was then. And as you can see, you know, there were the cannons are still there that were used to, you know, try and fight off other European invaders. So I've referred to the 1792 rebellion, which did become violent. And how did it end? Well, it ended by the British bringing in more rebellious, like really fierce, rebellious Africans who had also ended up in Nova Scotia. And these were the people called the Maroons, who had originally been in Jamaica. Very fierce, very strong fighting people. Of course, they wanted to escape Halifax. They didn't like living there any more than other Africans did. So the British negotiated with them that they would provide a home for them in Sierra Leone. But as part of the deal, they had to put down the rebellion by the 1792 settlers, which they did. And then they stayed on, and we kind of forgave them. And this brings me to the story of how captured Africans became Creoles, or as we call ourselves in Sierra Leone, Creos. So creolization is described by Mintz and Stewart as the process by which, the process produced by colonial rule of the transformation from slave agrarian capitalism. I've garbled that completely, so I'm just going to read the next bit. Originally, it meant native settlers who were born in colonies who were white or had lived so long in colonies that they acquired native characteristics. And I think we've all met, haven't we, you know, white Jamaicans who speak with a very strong Jamaican accent, and you're like, what the hell, you know? But actually, so those were originally and still are Creoles. Edward Glissant refers to Creoles as having been born of forced entanglement. So basically what it means is that everywhere where plantation slavery existed, there will be Creoles, there will be Creolized societies. Now, those were most often in the French colonies, and all Creoles come from different nations in Africa. They're forced together and they develop a language so that they can communicate with each other. So Sierra Leonean Creoles, of course, came about by the same process. So we're similar to all other Creoles, but in certain ways we're different, because most Creole societies stem from where slaves stolen from Africa remain in communities in the West Indies, or so I keep saying West Indies because that's what it says in history books, in the Caribbean, or the, you know, Gullah Coast, or the, you know, of North America, the southern coast of North America. So we arise sort of from that same process, but unlike those Creolized societies, Sierra Leonean Creoles actually went back to the continent of origin. There is a translation I once read of the term Creo from the Yoruba language, which describes us as those who wander about paying visits after church services. One of the features of Sierra Leonean Creoles is we do have this sort of syncretic community where we were educated by the Church Missionary Society, who went out to the colonies. So we spoke English in school, we followed a lot of English traditions, and we also invented our own. I want to say a word here about the Akus. Akus are basically Muslim Creoles, because Creoles are generally taken to be of the Christian faith, but there are Creo Muslims, who are generally called Akus, who live in Sierra Leone and the Gambia. And they're primarily the descendants of educated, liberated Yoruba Muslims. Now, what happened after the slave trade was finally abolished, thank you, in 1807-8, is that the trade continued, as we saw in that video. So the slave traders would still carry on raiding African villages, capturing Africans and loading them onto ships and trying to sell them. And this is where I think we can actually genuinely concede that we were, you know, these of our relatives who came from here were genuinely freed by the British, because the British stationed ships in the ports of the Sierra Leone harbour in Freetown, and would actually sail out to sea and recapture these slaving boats. And then they would bring these people into Sierra Leone and they would remain in Sierra Leone. So a lot of these people came from as far south as Angola, some from Nigeria and so on. So they joined with us to enrich our Creo society. And here I am with my partner outside the first university in Sierra Leone, Fourabé College, because it's at Fourabé. It became known as the Athens of West Africa because it produced so many intellectuals who made wonderful contributions to, well, all areas of medicine, science, the arts, and so on. And one of the most moving things about the sadness about the way this building has been left to rot is the fact that it was constructed, the floorboards in this building were actually constructed out of timber from the slaving ships that were recaptured and brought into the port of Freetown. So I hope we are able to do something to save this wonderful building, because it's got an incredibly inspiring history. So just to sum up, the history that I've been over about how the Creos came to be together. We were descendants of the Black Poor who arrived from Britain in 1787, and then followed by the 1792 settlers led by Thomas Peters and Cato Perkins from Nova Scotia. whose rebellion was put down by the Maroons, who stayed and then often intermarried with us, and then the 1808 onwards recaptives from the slave ships that were stopped from heading out to the high sea by the British. I want to give a shout out here to two organizations, the Krios.com and the Creo Descendants Union, who are doing fantastic work to record and honor Creo history and the legacy of that today. There is a Just Giving campaign which has been started by the Creo Descendants Union for us to set up a Creo museum in Freetown. And you can see here Iamide Thomas has been the driving force behind an exhibition in the Docklands Museum here in London on Creo history that you will be able to see. And here she's showing it, well, basically a Kaaba slot. We have these wonderful dresses which echo the dresses that were worn by Black women in the south of the north of the United States. Kaaba slots and print clothes. We are growing in the diaspora and we are becoming more assertive, and we are starting to revive some of our traditions. So when I was growing up, you would always see your grandmothers doing embroidery to make these carpet slippers, and it's really cute. Here's a Creo Descendants Union t-shirt which has got carpet slipper motif on it. So I love that. And we have a lot of ceremonies and traditions that came from our ancestors back in the day. So we have ceremonies like awujos, where we commune with our ancestors, pour libation, we all wear the same clothes, different prints for different occasions. And in Freetown, you will see these buildings, these wooden ones we call budos. They're very much like the buildings that you would see in South Carolina and Georgia, because when we came over to Freetown, we brought the architectural styles and all of that with us. We also have ceremonies like Pulnado, which are naming ceremonies, so different from they often go in tandem with Christian naming ceremonies, but a Pulnado is when a child, Pulnado means bring outside, when we first bring the child outside after confinement. And we have, as you will probably know, a lot in common with other West Africans, particularly Nigerians and Gambians. We cook very similar food that's used particularly on ceremonial occasions. We have certain rules that are a bit odd, like we don't eat palm oil on Sundays and so on. We have dishes like olele, which the Nigerians call moi moi. We all argue about who makes the best jollof rice, and of course Sierra Leoneans make by far and away the best jollof rice. You'll never have tasted anything like it. So after the 1792 settlement dissolved, a lot of people in the settlement moved up into the hills around the peninsula of Freetown. And it's quite quaint, really. A lot of them have names that reflect English linkages, mainly because of the Christian missionary societies and the colonial government that took over after slavery was abolished. So they've got villages around Sierra Leone with names like Kent, York, Regent, Hastings, Grafton, Wellington. And our language is obviously formed as a result of the creolization process. Our Creo has a clearly identifiable grammar and structure. So although we understand Nigerian Pidgin, it's not the same. Ours just is more sort of defined, basically. So here's a couple of very small churches from around the coast. The one on the right is actually a maroon church that's still there. And this is York Church, which is very beautiful. You'll pass it if you're driving out to one of our many beautiful beaches. Right, so I've said a lot. Thank you for bearing with me. I want to end with why it is important that we know about stories like the Creo history. Before coming online today, I used a currency calculator, which tells you, you go in and you put in how much, £1 in 1500, how much is it worth today? So I keyed in how much would £20 million be worth today. It's worth that amount of money. I can't even say it, but that's the amount of money that was paid as compensation to the slave owners. So those of us who were kidnapped, stolen, sold, brutalized, had the economies and developments of our countries disrupted by this violent trade, didn't get any compensation. We didn't. No, compensated the slave owners. I think it's important that we discuss things like this, because we know that the racialization of Black bodies, which is still used to dehumanize people of African descent, continues to this day. I only have to mention, you know, George Floyd and what happened. The fact that Black bodies, particularly Black male bodies, are still seen as a threat. We have to retell these stories. So I was brought up believing that the British freed us from slavery, and so we have to be grateful to us. I think I should have been taught that in 1562, Jack Hawkins and his ilk came to Sierra Leone and kidnapped and sold and brutalized Africans. They sold Africans and made us into slaves, and it affects us and our self-esteem, the way that we think about ourselves, the way that we are positioned in societies, our access to power, and so on. It affects our life. We were the focus of missionary activity. We, as Creos, the educated English-speaking ones, were co-opted by the colonial administration. So obviously, this deepened the rupture between Creos and the people who'd always remained in Sierra Leone, the other nations. And that is something that still affects Creo society to this day. But I do want to speak about the many contributions that Creos have made. We punch way above our weight, and we have some wonderful people now. For example, the current mayor of Freetown, Yvonne Aki-Sawyer, who'd lived for many years in England quite happily, and decided that she wanted to contribute to the growth and healing of her country. So she's gone back, become mayor, and is doing great things there. On the right is a reunion of people from my school, the Annie Walsh Memorial School. Not all of us are Creo, but a lot of us are. The school's in Freetown. In fact, looking at this picture, I think pretty much everyone in this picture is a Creo. But anyway, yeah, so that. Right. I could read you a list of people who are of Creo descent and what they've done, but I'll mention Samuel Coleridge Taylor, who composed the Hiawatha Opera, died tragically young at the age of 37. People like Idris Elba, and even Chadwick Boseman, may he rest in power. He undertook DNA testing, which he says indicated that his ancestors were Creo people from Sierra Leone. I'm going to end with this photograph, which I love. It just sums up the injustice and inequalities that continue to these days. I'm so glad that the statue of Colston, the massive slaver, is going to be in a museum, not on public display, being lionized. And we know, I mean, you just have to look at the statistics around COVID-19, the effects of discrimination that live on these days, the fact that there's higher rates of mental health distress in Black communities, the fact that our societies continue to suffer from poor housing, poorer education. We have to carry on combating inequality. And I think it's important to point out that when we combat inequality, we make society safe for everyone, not just for us. Working in development, I recognize that the trope of development is itself very problematic and contested, because it smacks of, I'm going to make you like me, I'm developed and I'm giving you aid, when we know that African countries are still suffering. The ability to develop was interrupted, was stolen. You just have to look at museums to see the amount of artifacts that were taken without permission from African countries. So there's a lot to say. I've said a lot. I'm going to stop talking now. I'm going to thank you for having listened to quite long, so much to say. I do feel passionate about it. Very grateful that you've joined me. I'm going to stop sharing the screen, and we'll happily take any questions or contributions from those of you here. So please go ahead and raise your hand in the participant section in Zoom. So my colleague Francesca is on hand. And can I just say, if you will have anything to say, could you just unmute your camera, put your microphone on and speak? Because I haven't been keeping an eye on the chat. So.
Hi, can you hear me, Shireen?
Yes, I can.
So I was writing you a long email, but I just thought that I was so moved that I'd actually just like to thank you for this amazing seminar, which I learned so much. I didn't know about your history of activism, you know, throughout your life, which is a bit sad to hear, given that we've worked together for 5 years. So shame on me. And that figure, I think it was 26 billion that went to that was given to compensate these slave owners. And I'd just like to say that I would hope and pray that the day for reparations is coming. And I think there's a lot more support for that in North America and elsewhere. So the thing I wanted to ask was, given there's a whole movement around decolonialization of development, is LIDC planning to keep up the momentum on this?
Well, we have started a decolonization working group, and I can see that there are a few people here who were in the who were in that group. So yes, and we're building towards a conference where we will, of course, be inviting partners from the Global South to attend. And the days that we've penciled in for that is June the 23rd and 24th. So it will probably be online on the afternoons of those days, but we'll keep you posted. And definitely, Hugh, as you're a colleague from the London School of Hygiene, if you want to come along to the decolonization working group meetings, shoot me an email and I'll just add you in. So yeah, definitely we're going to, you know, carry on. Right, we've got Morris. So I think I've got my colleague Francesca as well, helping to manage the participants. But I've got Maurice, Reverend Brown, with his hand up. If you'd like to lower your hand and unmute. There you are. Hi, hello.
Right. Well, thank you very much. Very good historical narrative, and it was very profound. I did enjoy it. My question is, I would like us to press on with the reparation in terms of compensation, just as was earlier said by the former gentleman. So if we all can come together sometime for reparation, financial compensation, I think it's a direction we need to push for. Thank you.
Thank you. And is there anyone else who would like to say anything? I think, did I just see Iyamide with her hand up? And if not, why not?
I'm muted. I'm going to, now that you've all seen my Creo print, I can, let me start the video. You know, I'm not wearing it, so I thought I'd take
Wonderful. Yeah, I love the print.
Oh,
Look
God,
very fine.
I'm trying.
Yes.
Hi, folks, and thanks for the big up, about the museum. What I wanted to say, sorry about the exhibition. Thanks, that was great, Shireen. What I wanted to say was that sometimes people have asked why sort of do an exhibition about, because our history as Creos obviously came about from the heinous act of slavery, right? And you've explained that so well today. But one of the things I really wanted to put out at that exhibition, which is why we have a notable Creo section, was the fact that we are the survivors, the resilience. I wanted to show that aspect of things, that despite the horrible history that we've been through, we're the survivors. And out of that came people who were pioneers in the world, people who were direct descendants, who had parents who were liberated Africans on those ships. People like Ajay Crowther, who was actually enslaved and on a ship and taken to Freetown, and yet he became the first Anglican bishop, African Anglican bishop. So it's a story of resilience as well. And I think that aspect should always be there in addition to what slavery did as a legacy to African countries. I just wanted to put that across, that we're resilient people. We are the survivors. Our ancestors, went through hell, but it's good for us to say that we as Creos living now are survivors, and we want to put that attitude out as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. I'm going to ask participants, please, could you keep your microphone muted unless you're actively asking a question, because otherwise it just affects the sort of bandwidth, basically. Now, I'm going to do something quite unconventional. I've just seen that we have with us Thomas Doughty, and is that how you say the name? Just wanted to ask if this is the same person who wrote about an article for LSE recently that referred to, sorry, I shouldn't do that, actually put someone on the spot. So I was just very excited when I saw a particular name flash up. So guys, if you have any contributions or comments or questions, you're going to have to raise your hand so that I know to come to you, because otherwise it's a one person show here, which I'd rather not happen now. So please do go ahead if you're from one of our member colleges, or you know anything about Sierra Leone, or have a comment about how how my presentation relates to what's happening in the global development landscape now. So I think I've got a message about So Francesca, I haven't been keeping an eye on the chat. So if you want to read out any questions from the chat, that would help me a lot rather than me having to scroll all the way through them.
Yes, if anyone would like to kind of, it's a bit of stage fright and doesn't really want to be put on the spot, if you want to type anything in the chat, I'll read it out for you.
Yes, great. So, and if there's any questions or comments in the chat that you want to read out, then please do go ahead.
We have a lot of comments praising you, Shireen. So how many do you want me to read? There's a lovely comment from Annie saying, such a wonderful presentation, so informative, yet accessible and engaging. Thank you so much, Annie, for that. Yes. I'm sorry, I'm really sorry, yeah, if I butcher your name, apologies in advance, but they write, thank you for this presentation. I recently learned via DNA testing that I am Mende, and so this presentation serves as a great jump-off point to explore my Mende heritage. Unfortunately, they had to leave us, but very interesting.
And there's a question from Karine Bambara, is Creo the main language in Sierra Leone? And yes, it is. It's basically our lingua franca. I think if you go throughout the country, you will find most people will be able to speak some Creo. So I'm going to take this opportunity now to remind you that LIDC is a membership organization, but even if you are a student, then we do have options for students to join. which mean you don't have to be in a member institution. And for everyone else, find out who our member institutions are and sign up through them, because it will be free. And if not, shoot me an email if you're interested in membership. And we have one of my best friends, Abdul Sohud Kome, who I'm going to ask to unmute. So could you, yes. Papa, you do well for me where you come.
I'm not going to miss him. You know, sir,
no pimples.
I just want to say thank you. It was an amazing presentation. Thank you. Well done. I was actually intending to speak to Yamide Thomas, but I think she's left.
No, she's here. She's here.
Okay. I've been following the success of the Creole Descendants Association and the other organizations. I was just thinking, are there any efforts in place now in terms of the preservations of some of the sites you showed, like Bunce Island, because they look abandoned, in the sense that I don't feel there's a strong enough conversation within Sierra Leone where adequate funds would be allocated by the government into preserving those sites. Otherwise, if they disappear, then what's the point? So I felt maybe Yamide Thomas would be somebody very important to ask that question, in the sense, because she's actively pursuing preserving the culture as it is now. Okay. But if you can help, you'll be amazing too.
Let me unmute. It's a shame that Melbourne Garber has left, because he is very much involved in the preservation of Bunce Island. They are actually, there's funding, and they are actually, Melbourne, for those that don't know him, is a civil engineer who's really involved with the preservation of Bunce Island project. Sohud, is it Sohud Kome?
It is, yes.
If you go on the Krios.com Facebook page, we actually there's an update there with some of the pictures of that from visit, Bimbola's site, visitsierraleone.org, and it shows the progress they've made in preserving Bunce Island. Because that's a tourist, that's potential heritage tourism right there. So, yeah,
and
please support that they're preserving Bunce Island.
Okay, and I think I may have been to Plantain Island, because often it's forgotten. Whenever analyses are made on slavery in Sierra Leone, too often people forget about Plantain Island, and it is perhaps in a worse state than, say, Bunce Island is now.
Is that possible?
And I think recently I saw a program on the BBC, and I could see what Senegal is doing with their sites.
Yeah.
Gory.
Okay. I was wondering why Sierra Leone being so relevant in the whole story itself. Why are we lagging so far behind in terms of preserving the sites?
I think, if I may step in, we could ask that question about every aspect of Sierra Leone's.
That's another webinar or another.
Yeah. I think it's going to be, we have to be the change that we want to see. We have to do it. I mean, in everything from opposing racism on a daily basis to opposing all kinds of discrimination, to preserving the aspects of our history and culture that we want to have, preserved. So it is down to us. I mean, they say if you want something done, ask a busy woman. You've just asked a busy woman. So we'll be talking to Yamide. We'll continue the conversation with Yamide and the Krios.com and the Creo Descendant Union. Exactly. There is also a very helpful link that my colleague Penny Vera Sanso from Birkbeck College has placed in the chat about the fact that British taxpayers are still paying compensation to those who benefited from the slave trade. I think I'm going to round up the discussion now. I have spoken at great length. Do please sign up to receive our mailing list and news of our events. please do follow us on Twitter. It's not a difficult name to remember, LIDC, so just Google us. We're the ones that's not the Leeward Islands debating competition. We're the London International Development Centre. So do link up with us so we can take these discussions and this work forward. I'm going to thank everyone who's joined us today, Rosemary, Manley, Spain, everybody else. Thank you so much for participating. Thank you for the great comments, and let's stay in touch.
Shireen, quick question. I asked whether the recording was public.
Oh yes, yeah, there will be a recording. We do post the recordings of all our events on our website. So we'll tweet about it and put it on Facebook when we do. But yeah, we will, yeah. So thanks everyone. Let's keep up the struggle.
Thanks, well done. Yeah.
Thank you, good weekend, bye-bye.